Welcome to Influence, the podcast that dives deep into the heart of influencer marketing and the creator economy with the people who know it best, the agents, creators, and marketers who operate behind the scenes. This podcast is hosted by Powder, where streamers can search their best moments to find short, shareable stream clips with AI. And I'm your host, Alyssa Goldberg. We're happy to welcome our guest, Matt Woods, CEO and co-founder of AFK Group, a global digital marketing and talent agency specializing in esports and gaming at first. Under this umbrella, Woods has helped brands, companies, and content creators figure out the creator economy and influencer marketing industry at large. He's a content creator in his own right, having produced content on Twitch and YouTube and having been a pro player himself. And he's incredibly knowledgeable about this industry and vocal about where it's headed. So we are thrilled to have him on the podcast with us today. Welcome, Matt. It's really a pleasure to have you with us.
Hey, this is my pleasure.
Just to kick things off, can you tell us a little bit about your journey into the influencer marketing space and what inspired you to start AFK in the first place?
Yeah, of course. So, as you mentioned, my journey really began when I was making content myself. It was something I did, I would say, not all my life making content. Obviously, games has been a big part of my life, but alongside studying, alongside work, I was very much in the laboratory trying to make content on Twitch and YouTube, and not really to be successful in the ideas of like chasing fame, but more of just sharing knowledge, education, and having fun with friends along the way. And through that process, I really built a network of content creators, and a lot of them were far more successful and well known than I was. And it was that really allowed me that kind of like gateway entrance into understanding, hey, what are the challenges that these people are facing? Are there any problems that I can help with? My background was in startups. It was in marketing and growth. And, this is going back 6+ years. So it was very much at that early stage, at least in the gaming side of the content creation influencer marketing industry, where suddenly there was interest from brands, from publishers, developers. And it was a case of, hey, we want to work with these people making this awesome content. What does that look like? And those questions were taking place, and there wasn't that business experience or acumen on the side of the creators either, which was what could we actually strike up in terms of a deal? How would that look like? What is the importance of a contract? All these kind of basic fundamental things, and ultimately understanding like what, from a creative perspective, what are they worth, and from that brand perspective equally, right? What would make sense? Like, where do I actually see like a return on this value? How do I track it? How do I measure like a successful campaign or not? So I had exposure to that early on, and it was very much for me like I'm always about like helping other people, and I wanted to help as many people as possible. So my journey was from helping my friends who were the content creators to then being engaged with these brands and figuring out, hey, how can I help them strategically do this better? And fortunately enough, there was a lot of hard work in that involved as well. But for a big part of fortune, which is required, I've been lucky enough to build an agency, a business, and a life off of that for the last 5+ years.
That's so cool. I have a few questions following up on that. The first one is, when you were a content creator and you were meeting other content creators, I've always wondered, how does that work? How did you kind of connect with other content creators, and where were you connecting, like in digital space, and what typically were you connecting about?
Yeah, it's always difficult. I can't say exactly how it is today. Maybe things have changed per se. But at that time, it was very much a case of I was making content primarily on League of Legends, and I would meet other content creators in League of Legends. Maybe I watch their videos, I watch their streams, but I would always meet them in game. So like we'd play a game together, and then we would like reach out after one of us, or we would both be like streaming or making content. So maybe someone would just drop like a Discord link in the game chat, and we'd all just jump in a lobby together. Or it was like, hey, someone's finished their stream, someone would say, hey, that other guy in your game is also a streamer in the community, and then that would be the moment where they host you or they raid you, and then off the back of that you start a relationship. So it was all very, very organic. But I think whatever you're doing, there is always like, I don't want to call it like research, but if you're doing something and you're you're always trying to go outside that echo chamber. So if you're making
Mm,
content on, I don't know, World of Warcraft as an example, you're going to be looking like, hey, what are other successful World of Warcraft creators are doing? So you always have that knowledge of like who these other people are in your circle, at least like the immediate one. And it's just a matter of like where you see that opportunity, putting yourself out there, like anything in life. Uh,
yeah,
the first step is always the hardest, and someone has to make that move. And for many cases, I think people think, oh, like maybe they'll think I'm stealing their viewers or some of their ideas, but it's very lonely life being a content creator. And I think
yeah,
actually, like people are always looking to connect with others who kind of get what their life circumstances is. So I would encourage any creator to reach out to another because quite cold like that.
totally. And how did you, when you realized that a lot of the creators you were friends with were having similar problems and that maybe you could help them solve them, what was the kind of the first activation that you did, and who was the first client?
Yeah, so there were like a few around the same time, but I think probably like the notable one, the one that I was like where it actually happened and said, okay, right, this is something bigger than what I've been doing to date, like just here and there, was
Mm,
um the client was a company called U.GG. They still
mm,
exist. For now they're in multiple games, but they're effectively at that time a League of Legends stats and guides website for the most part.
nice.
And given that I was in League of Legends, it was a case where I really connected with a guy over there called Chris, and it was a case of, hey, I would love to work with you. At the time, it was me and a couple of my friends, but really, he was looking at doing something massive. And it was a
Mm,
case of like I knew what he wanted to do and that I could help, and therefore, I put that offer out there, and that became kind of like probably the first big client that we had that was successful as well,
mm,
at some scale. And with regards to like who was that with, I mean, it was with pretty much everybody that I knew at that time in League of Legends content creation scene, like 5 6 years ago. And thankfully, some of those people, like I can say, are my friends that I still see and speak to today at like every single event that I go to. So,
that's cool.
yeah, that was quite special.
Yeah, that is really special, and you never forget the first people who took a chance on you, and especially when things kind of come together, it feels like serendipity, but it's actually a culmination of a lot of effort and little trials and errors along the way.
Yeah, for sure.
Um, at AFK has grown quite a bit since then. Can you share a few key milestones, like, I don't know, one, two, and what they meant for you and the team, and how you approach them? And they could be positive or negative. It kind of depends on how you approached it.
Mm. Yeah, I think people view milestones in like in different ways, and I think um hindsight's a wonderful thing. But as you grow in your journey, like whatever that may be, whether it's running a YouTube channel or a company, like what you initially start out thinking like these are like milestones or measurements of success,
Yeah.
quite change. So like I remember at the start it was very much a case like um, I went from being myself out of my living room, then having a co-founder, then building a team that was growing really quickly. To give some like sort of context, it went from something like three of us, nine of us, 15, 30,
Mm.
50 odd. So it's grown every year, and initially like that's a real metric that everybody uses in the real world. Like, oh, how big's your company? And people say, hey, we're
Right,
like
like
50
100
people, 100 people.
FTEs. Yeah.
Yeah, exactly, right. I
Yeah.
quickly came to realize like that's not a really good like milestone of success. It's a measurement of
No.
growth.
Yeah.
But I think really like for me like one of my big milestones that like passed without too much celebration, but actually was a big deal, was like this year, at the start of the year, like we were like 5 years as an incorporated company.
Oh, that's cool.
um and one of the things I say that's important is like my view on being in the creator economy, influencer marketing, gaming, entertainment industry is like still early. Like the real test of time of any successful business is like, are you here for like 15 years, 2 decades, and
Totally.
whatnot?
And
And I've been
consistently operating at a high level for that long period of time because it's so difficult to do.
Yeah, and like, my business will never be like this massive, thousands of people company. But when you meet your, not, I don't want to say your heroes, but when you meet these people from these companies like Nintendo or PlayStation, whatever,
Yeah.
that you've grown up with a childhood, you realize like, well, they actually haven't been around, like centuries. But look how far they've come in that period of time, and they're still here,
Totally.
like killing it every year and really driving everything forward. So, I think that was one milestone, and I think probably like working with certain different, combination of like partners, like whether that be, like an influencer that you've always admired and maybe has like
Mm.
millions of followers, or being we were fortunate enough during our company time to like work with some of the biggest social media platforms, or AAA game publishers. Like once you've worked with these people, like that's where you have some moments where you can actually tell, at least in my case, like you can tell like your mum and dad, or you can tell your friend,
Yeah,
hey, we
yeah.
did X, right? And they actually get it, which is a hard, like, easy thing to
That's
say, but
cool.
like not everybody understands, right? Outside the space that you work in. So those were some cool moments. I remember like where we did some stuff on a campaign with Lord of the Rings on Prime Video, and that was like epic to work on,
Nice.
just from yeah.
Yeah, especially from like a personal interest standpoint, from like a how well known that title is and so on.
Yeah, for sure. And I think like when I think about what we're focused on at the moment as well, and like the next couple years, like especially, I don't want to say like going back to that like basic grassroots, but going back to
Mm,
like the origin passion. Like it all started because not only helping friends, but also like working in a space that you just like loved, wanted to be in it. Like
yeah.
that's what I thought about all the time. Like, oh, how can I work in this space? So more so than ever, probably the best way of putting it. Like I'm really focused on how do we work with more publishers, developers, and really focusing on like on games.
Yeah.
I'm proud to say we helped a lot of brands like enter into the
Mm,
space. But I think like working on a game that you're going to play, if you had any moment of your days, play it anyway, and then actually helping them be a success and launch, or come up with a really cool creative like campaign idea, like that's the stuff that I love.
yeah, totally. And I was gonna ask, uh, has your approach to AFK to influencer marketing, how has that changed since you first started? It's and 5 years is like an eternity in influencer marketing lands. And so I imagine that there's like different strategies that you've employed and different you know, ways that you've constructed your team 3 years ago versus today. You said you're almost like going back to kind of a more like intimate format. Like what have you learned along the way and where are we now?
Yes, for sure. I mean, like especially in this industry, like 5 years feels like forever.
Yeah.
Um, and for anyone who's like worked in like a small company or like startup, like you know the normal day is not a normal day. Like whatever kind of is required, like you find a way to get it done.
Yeah.
So even a year feels like at least two. But I think influencer marketing, like like any industry, like it like kind of goes through different like iterations.
Mm,
I remember a few years ago we kind of went through this like tech iteration where everyone was only trying to build like tech platforms and saying, hey, we're going to create marketplaces, and through
mm,
the marketplace, like everything's going to become easier. But that never really happened. Like I'm a firm believer, at least with what we do. Tech is a tool, but like people are really the
yeah.
driving force of the business, and it's so relationship driven and service based. Like tech will never like fully replace it, even if elements can be automated. um, there's definitely been a cyclical change as well within the last like 12 to 18 months, where
Mm,
more people are looking, especially in the gaming space, like how do they like actually work with the communities,
right.
rather than just like the biggest influencers, which was kind of, I don't want to say like a tick box exercise, but obviously it's far easier to work with like a handful of people than it is to do something
Totally.
at scale.
Yeah, with like
Um,
100 people who are very, very specialized in this like one game mechanic that they absolutely love.
yeah,
Yeah.
yeah, pretty much. And I think like what I'm hoping for as well as like things will change in the landscape over the next like 12 months is like we're gonna get much more focus on like quality as well.
Mm.
Especially like during COVID and post COVID, there was just like everyone and their son was doing like gaming.
Yeah, that's true.
So
Wait,
so
literally everyone and their son was doing gaming. Like that.
yeah,
That
so
definitely. Yeah, that's true.
so like that meant like a lot of things were just like done in a way which obviously probably wasn't like the best, or maybe it's sort of like what they actually like wanted to from that. And I think inevitably like that forces people to like relook. And I think forever, right, like the quality of whether like content or whatever the form of activation someone does, like that will always be kind of like king.
Yep.
And then obviously then it comes about like how do you distribute that. I think that would be much more impactful moving forward if people adopt that. And especially with like the uncertainty still, like especially in the gaming
Yeah.
industry, there's a lot of layoffs, a lot of like what does the future look like. So I think in that kind of
Hmm.
uncertain times, it's a pretty good way to go, is just like doing really specific stuff but with purpose at a high
Yeah.
quality level.
Yeah, and then making sure it's like very human centric, relationship driven, as you mentioned, and so on.
Hmm.
Well, you mentioned a couple of like big dominant, I'm not going to say trends, but like trends that are happening in gaming. What are some trends that you're observing in influencer marketing right now, and how do you see them impacting the way that brands and creators collaborate?
Yeah, so I think like one of the biggest things definitely in the like influencer marketing space that I've seen is this real push to people having to be like everywhere. It's almost kind of already like exhausted itself because it's just unsustainable.
Yep.
Um, but there was almost like two sides to it. Like at the beginning, it was, hey, if you're not on this platform, you're missing out, and the platform being like TikTok, followed by like YouTube Shorts. It's
Yep.
like, hey, if you're not engaging in these forms of content, like you're missing out on this amazing opportunity to grow and blah 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 blah. And I think like that still remained, but it's
Mm.
kind of got a bit like the reality has dropped. Like, hey, you cannot just copy and paste content over. You cannot, what works on one platform while you're successful just doesn't resonate on the other. And equally, like, it's not sustainable, especially unless you have like a team around you
Yeah.
to distribute content on so many platforms and keep the audience engaged and build the same connections. So that's already kind of like, I would say, fading a little bit, but I still think it's a
Mm.
very important, because I think what that has done combined with like the next trend I've seen, that sounded like really like buzzwordy, is it is like the actual like refocus. And this is kind of like, at least for me, like an industry wide like penny drop on monetization.
Yeah.
It's been a lot harder for creators to like monetize successfully at the moment. And a lot of platforms as well as like brands, like the revenue that was there like a couple of years ago isn't at the same. So I think a lot more of the decisions now that are being made are like careful
Mm.
considerations around, hey, what is the best use of my time? Where do I really want to focus? Like those more serious
Yeah.
questions, self-reflective, that people ask themselves. And that's only good in the long run, because it means that again, people will build careers out of specifically like one thing, and they'll do it in a higher quality way that they'll be more successful at. And I think that was a lot of the reality for people who stream. I think
Mm.
platforms like Twitch and YouTube and Kick, like it can go we can go back years. Like since I've been doing this, there's always been like streaming wars going on.
Yeah.
Um, but it's almost like the war has ended, and then what's left in that wake is, okay, like where do I stream? What do I stream? How often do I still stream? Like, should I
Mm.
be doing less on that so I can build my brand or my content elsewhere? So I think we'll see people like really again thinking more carefully about like what it is they're doing with their time.
Yeah, I think that's right. And I was listening to a podcast episode the other day. It was from one of like the New York Times podcasts, I think. And it was the episode was is TikTok over basically, and it was talking about how I mean there was this gold rush with TikTok in the last several years where you really you really could go viral overnight being an absolute nobody, and people could build a career out of that. And that was a real thing that was happening. And now it's happening a lot less frequently. I mean, gaming the algorithm, everyone is trying to do that. And so now you get this kind of feeling of inauthenticity when you're there, of people just trying to game the algorithm. And even people who succeed maybe overnight, but then within 1 or 2 days, their cycle of going from nobody to being backed by a brand to then falling into obscurity happens at such a fast rate that it's like almost impossible to keep up. And then, as you mentioned, more and more difficult to monetize sustainably. And so it feels like now people are like, okay, now we treat TikTok kind of like every other platform. And we think about whether we act, does this make sense for me and my goals? Does this make sense for me and my community? Is my community a community that like wants to interact with me live? Is this a community that wants to interact with me asynchronously? Do I do lifestyle content? Do I do like whatever? Do I do all of these things? And then picking their platform from there. But you're right, it's like there was a time when it was like all the algorithms like they just love the short video, let's give them all the short video. And now they're kind of like, no, we have our own way of doing things. Like Reels has a different approach than Shorts does, and like being streaming on Twitch is like not the same as streaming on YouTube, to your point.
Yeah,
And I
no,
think that, yeah.
I was just gonna say like that like gold rush, there was just that like perfect storm in time, right, where
Yes.
it all kind of like happened, and it
Trapped
was
at
almost like
home.
no, but it was like nobody was ready for it as well, right? When you look
Yeah.
at like other platforms, like no one was able to iterate. I think I remember like Instagram bringing out Reels, and like Instagram was like probably like the fastest to react in like building their
Yeah.
product in a way to compete, as well as Facebook in general and the Meta suite. But definitely like YouTube bringing out Shorts was probably like the biggest thing to it. But that took like a long time. So I don't know. I've definitely seen exactly what you're talking about. Like I think people who are successful streaming on YouTube, they do have a different strategy to streaming on Twitch or streaming on TikTok. And just again from my side, I think there was almost like a god place level of status put on TikTok at a time, where
Yeah.
any like D2C brand was like TikTok number one, like that's where it's going to build our brand,
But
like
they
from
could
awareness, from
literally
sale.
like go do 4 million in sales overnight. Like, when that's an actual reality for Scrub Daddy, you're like, why not me and my sponge equivalent?
Yeah, yeah, and so like there was cases like that, but I kind of feel like that the status has kind of changed a bit, and it also is like very like strategic as well. So
Yeah.
at least from my side, right, in influencer marketing, definitely TikTok has become more and more of like an e-commerce focus,
Yes.
and where it is outside of e-commerce, at least what I've seen success, it's always a lot more on the UGC side, like people who are
Mm,
making quality content that is getting pushed to people, and it's very much like, hey, we have a really small budget, we can get as much reach as possible and therefore chance of success off of TikTok. Whereas I think on other
yeah,
platforms, it's like it's still quite limited. Like, hey, if I spend $1,000, my results could be this. And like, TikTok's a bit more of a gamble
totally.
into the influencer marketing casino. But like the potential upside, like I think if you have small budget and you're just like hoping that this could get big, but if it doesn't, it's all right. Like that's where I'd go first as like a marketer.
Yeah, that's such a good way to put it. Gambling at the influencer marketing casino. I really like that phrase. It's true. It is like that. And I think that, but I think also for the first time, you're seeing people who focus on TikTok only, and they like they're like, nah, I'm not going to Twitch or YouTube. Like, that's too much work.
Yeah,
Um,
but I think there's also like this like I don't want to say like job career element of it, but I know people
yeah,
who have switched to from full-time streaming and YouTube to full-time TikTok and doing the other stuff on the side, and it's almost like the stability of the revenue and knowing that like, hey,
yeah,
if I pump out this content times X, I will get this revenue, and a lot of the other platforms are quite unreliable like that.
really. Like,
Um,
you think that TikTok is more reliable than like YouTube?
Yeah, then live streaming. And I
Yeah,
think with
true.
YouTube, like again, the expectation of content, right? Like the content expectation on a YouTube video is high quality, longer
Mm,
format.
yeah,
And I'm not an that I was gonna say an expert, but I'm not that well acquainted at the moment on like how YouTube short revenue monetization is.
yeah,
But there was a period where like, that wasn't making any money. I'm not saying TikTok revenue monetization is the best in the world, but like there's definitely like a lot more opportunities if you're making bespoke content for the purpose that like brands or publishers could be interested in working with you. Um, but yeah, going back to that casino quote, it might just be because I've been to Vegas, but it's very much the case of like working with creators, if you're from a brand's perspective, like it is always like very risky.
yeah,
And I think if you can do anything to like minimize that edge of like, hey, if we do XYZ, we have the best chance of success, then that's what people always lean to. So um that's why, from my perspective, when people always ask like, hey, so what's the value of working with agency, and I see this all the time on different like social platforms where people are like, hey, I can do this myself. It's just making sure you avoid the mistakes or like those
yeah.
losses where it's like, hey, we worked with this person, it was a big investment and it didn't work out. And that's where any partner will be able to come in and say, hey, I know you want to do this, but like I probably advise against that, and this is why. Speaking from like that historical experience that they've had and that knowledge built over time.
When you're talking to creators and brands, how do you guide them into understanding that maybe they need to make some choices? Like, how do you tell them when it's time to, like, you think it might be time to open a new channel, when to stop trying on a one that's looking kind of sad, or when a channel just isn't worth it? Like, there's no money for you here, there's no audience for you here. Like, how do you, how do you
No, yeah,
convey
no,
that?
no one's listening. Yeah. No, I think you just got to be honest, right, and direct. Like,
Mm,
I always think, like, obviously, if depending on what you're doing, like, some things can have a longer runway than others. But I usually say, like, you can kind of tell within like 2 weeks of testing any channel, like, is there anything here for you? And
mm,
obviously, that depends on the size of like the test budget you're doing and the scale. Again, going back to like testing one person versus 30, like one person will never be a test. And at least for influencer marketing, like the strategy that's always worked for me, and this is, I guess, speaking more towards the performance side of it than brand awareness, is you will test 20 influencers and your expectation is 20 will do amazing and maybe 40% do good, and the other 40%, like, they won't get the results you expect, of which like 10% might be abysmal. And it's about like understanding like, hey, if this is a channel that you want to try, you need to give it some time to test and iterate and build on those channels that are successful and find lookalikes, and then over time you will build up that history, right? So there's a lot of there's a lot of ways to do it like that, but I think most importantly, when you're working with a brand on that influence marketing, or even working with influencers, it's just having honest conversations. Like, often those creators will be able to tell you from the beginning, hey, do I think this is going to work, or is there a better way I would like to do it? And
mm.
when you speak with them, they will give what I would call like kind of like creator led ideas,
Yeah,
which the amazing creators you might have back at home or in the office, they won't ever be able to fully get, you know.
yeah.
And even then, like, they might have a amazing campaign, but it's for a mass audience and not specifically tailored for that
Mm,
person's viewers. So yeah, and ultimately, I think one of the ways of knowing like is a channel viable or not for a partner is, unfortunately, like the the ways of working and like the budget. I think sometimes
Yeah,
um we'll have people come to us and not to say the budget can't work, but maybe it's not something that we can help them with.
yeah,
But being able to direct them in order to say, hey, like, working within these constraints, this is what I would do to give you the best chance of success for what you're looking for. So having that kind of I guess like advice, like I think the specifically in this space, the worst thing or like the worst feeling for anyone is when someone wants to try it, really enthusiastic, and then they don't find success, and
yeah,
then because the experience is so bad, like they might not return. I think that is what any like good actor in the space should like be trying to avoid, whether or not it's to their own personal benefit or
totally.
not.
And well, you were talking before about new monetization opportunities, how it's getting harder and harder for creators to make money. I think that's categorically true. Just also, I mean, it always happens when people see lots of money. They're like lots of people come in, then there's the market saturated, so there's fewer dollars going to each individual. How are you thinking about where the good opportunities for monetization are right now, and kind of what are some newer avenues you're seeing to help someone build a sustainable career in content creation?
Yeah, that's really interesting because again, like when we spoke about like industry trends per se, like over the last 5 6 years, like I've seen so many different things where, and obviously sometimes it's about timing, right? Like
Yeah.
the idea of subscription platforms, like when Patreon first like kind
Yes.
of skyrocketed, it was like perfectly placed and positioned, and there was no one really doing that. And then, you have the platforms introducing their own subscription models and tier systems, third party, like other startups kind of like coming up with
Yep.
that. And that was like a phase of time, and almost subscriptions are less and less something that can be relied upon, in my personal opinion.
Yeah.
Certainly, I'm sure Patreon is still like a hugely successful company, finding like different audiences to tap into where the product market fit is better and better. But in a world where like not everybody can choose to have Netflix, Disney Plus, and Amazon Prime at the moment,
Yeah.
the idea that all three of those get replaced with three influencers, even that, like there's no, what about everybody other influencers other than those top three? So
Totally.
um I think right now, I'll be honest, like I haven't really seen any like solutions coming to the space. I think there are certainly opportunities out there. I would say like UGC, like people who are willing to make content for brands
Mm.
and partners over just for themselves has probably been the biggest thing. Like I see that a lot
Yeah.
more as a natural thing that takes place outside of gaming, where people like see it as a job basically. Hey, I make
Yeah.
content as a job. But in like passion based verticals, like it doesn't have to be gaming, it could be sewing or reading
Totally.
books. I'm trying to think of something at the top of my head, but like a lot of the people that became or are so-called like influencers for making content, they never set out for it in like a certain way. At least that was the historical trend.
Yeah.
Now it might be a bit different, and so a lot of those people, like, they would be against making content that they wouldn't choose to make if it was for like a partner. Um,
Mm.
so that might change. But certainly, like, I'm seeing less and less opportunities around like merchandise and physical products. Like,
Yep.
you know, maybe today, like, Bitcoin will reach a new all-time high, but there was a lot of past kind of like, hey, each creator can have their own coin or
Yep.
NFT type thing, and thankfully that's all died down. But there hasn't been any real new like monetization solutions coming into the space. But I would say that's probably a good thing, because what
Yeah.
that allows people to do is understand, okay, right, long-term sustainability, I need to make a living off this for as far as I can see into the future. What are the things that I want to do every single day and as best as I
Yep.
can, and how do I do that in order to be a success and earn the living that they need and want. So um, in many ways, I think that's like a good thing, and I know more and more kind of like platforms and content types are getting like opportunities. So we're here on this podcast.
Yes.
That's something that we started doing over a year ago, was like podcast marketing for brands, and
Yeah.
we've seen huge success for brands and that getting a return on their investment, which isn't something like we had done in the past. Often they had. So there's always like new channels, and like
Totally.
inevitably at some point there, it could be tomorrow, there'll be like, what is that next gold rush TikTok platform? I only think like those platforms are going to continue to pop up. So we'll have to wait and see.
Yeah, I think that's really insightful, and I think that it's tough because some people will see, one influencer suddenly has a clothing brand or has a makeup brand or has a podcast or whatever, and you kind of assume that that's like your exit or a online course or something. But it's like as soon as it has been proven by someone who has a big audience, like you can bet there's going to be a lot of copycats. And so like you just kind of have to get more and more creative. But yeah, it's an interesting time to try to make money on the internet. Um,
Yeah, and also you got to remember as well that like okay, yeah, there's courses out there. Like I've always said this, that like not just myself, but like there's certain people out there who probably should share their knowledge a little bit more
yes,
openly and willingly. But realistically, like there is no guide, there's no playbook. Hey, do X, Y, Z.
no,
And that's the hardest thing about people who set out on this career in industry. There's no kind of like vocational training or suggested path.
yeah,
And let's say Mr. Beast is like the Godfather. Um, Not everybody can have a burger restaurant, even if they are as successful as Mr. Beast, because there's only so many places people want to go and eat burgers. So then the
right,
next person has to think, hey, maybe I'll have a cereal line or a chocolate bar, whatever that may be. And often those things, like they're at a point where those creators, that they're not, the extent to which they're driving that versus people are trying to push them towards these opportunities. It's as much outside inside forces. It's very like not scalable and not a cookie cutter approach. And I think
yeah. It's like
all of the people,
celebrities all having tequila brands and lipsticks. Like,
exactly,
how
yeah.
many can they
So
have?
yeah, so unless there is really like and this is what I always go down to say, like the creators need to have something they're really passionate and want to do.
Yeah,
No one can say, hey, you should do this, and it will really be a success unless that person's like, hey, I'll do whatever you tell me. Um, but then that's not the, like, that person won't be the essence of why it's successful. And
right.
that's why creators work, right? Like the reason why is people get attached to them based on how passionate or how knowledgeable or how
Yep.
creative those people may be. um, so I really think like that's the classic. Like I just did this recently where you force yourself to take some time off, you step back, you have this self-reflection, hey, what is everything I'm
Mm,
doing? What might I want to do next? And then you figure out, hey, I'm going to invest some time or some money or some effort into trying something new. And that, could be a podcast, or it could be, hey, I really want to, make a water brand or whatnot.
yeah.
But if that comes from the individual, then they have every chance for it to be successful. If it comes from like, hey, this other person's doing that, so maybe I should, then they'll only ever be as good at best as the other person, right? And
Right.
even that isn't, might not be enough, because then you're the second best water brand, right?
Totally.
So yeah.
Well, so with that in mind, what advice would you give to someone looking to enter the influencer marketing industry today?
So I think at this point, right, like all the obvious is should be just like ticked off, right? Like people will know like what influencers are and what those channels are. Maybe they won't know every channel, especially like if you go down to like specific channels, like Twitch being more for gaming as an
Mm.
example. But think first advice is like think about exactly. I always, this is how I think anyway. I always work backwards. So like,
Mm-hmm.
what is ultimately like the important thing for you to achieve? That's like your
Yeah.
metric, whether that be like, hey, we want to reach new people or educate them, or drive users or sign up sales, whatever that may be. I always work back from that. And I'm not saying that's necessarily like the vehicle of influencer marketing, but that's what you want to get out of it, because that's most important to define. Because if that's not achievable, then why do it in the first place? Going back to your point, like how do you tell people not to do something?
Yeah.
And then build your strategy backwards. And when you work in that way, then you'll have quite clear expectations that you can set, and then obviously those goalposts may move. So like, for example, I'm just going to make something up, but let's say, hey, I wanted to get 100 people come to my website. You then have a really clear idea, like, okay, so if I work with one influencer this size or 10 influencer this size, what is the probability that they could drive this many users to come to my website? And you can really
Yep.
reverse engineer it all the way back to before you even contact anybody,
Mm.
identifying, hey, okay, I need to find 50 people like this to be able to outreach to that on these platforms, making this type of content, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So like I would just say really think it through. Um, obviously I have like the bias of saying, hey, you should like find a partner like an agency.
Yeah.
But what I would actually say is like for anyone as well who's never done it before, anyone can enter influencer marketing. There's no barrier to entry. Like you can just decide tomorrow, hey, I want to get this podcast out to more people. I'm going to find people that might be interested or have audience that are interested and contact them and see if they want to do something.
Yep.
And I really recommend like everyone to go through that, because then they'll
And you'll
really
see very
understand.
quickly why an agency is so important. Yes. Yes.
Exactly, like when you only get responses at 2 a.m. on a Sunday,
Oof.
and
Been
and
there.
whatever that may be.
Yeah.
So that there's a lot of stuff that can be saved for like a podcast of a different name, but
Yep.
I think it's really important for someone to go through it and understand like what does it entail, because there really is the good, bad, and the ugly with influencer marketing, and no one can tell you like what to expect. Like like once you've done it, then you understand how it works, you understand the process, um and like the person might have a perfect you know experience, and that's like obviously the ideal. But if they don't, then they can obviously understand like, hey, this was terrible, maybe there's a better way of doing this, because this is still something I want to try, or like there might be that glimmer of hope, like you know based on those goals that person set out. So that's what I would really say, and then ultimately try to fit it around like another part of your marketing strategy. I think like that's where influence marketing also does best, when it's not solely the driver of one metric but part
Right.
of a wider campaign. Like, I don't need to probably explain like marketing principles, but if that one influencer is the only person talking about it, and that's the only time the audience have ever seen the brand or product, like it's not going to have as much as an impact of a much wider reaching campaign where that's like one touch point in a multitude of them.
Yeah, absolutely. And what advice would you give to individuals aspiring to become influencers?
So I don't think I would advise anyone wanting to become like an influencer from the outset, because okay, that's maybe not the right word, but like I think if you go and say, hey, I want to influence people, you might end up becoming like Julius Caesar or someone. Like you might
Yeah,
you
you'll
quickly
be in
go on a power
politics.
trip.
Yeah.
Yeah, exactly. So like there's probably not like the way to go about it per se, but I think my advice is anyone can make content. Like there's no reason why anyone isn't doing it right now. Do it on something that you absolutely love, whatever that may be. There's an audience for it. Like I always use the example, and now I'm going to blank on his name, but there's a very famous guy in the UK who made TikToks around train watching.
I love
I think his
that.
name was Francois or something, but he became hugely popular across the whole of the world for his love of train spotting, and that was just who he was, and that's what people connected with.
Totally.
And the bigger thing, definitely on that note, is actually what goes into the content. Like, it's so easy for some people to grab their phone, do a funny dance, or record themselves playing a game that they play otherwise, and for them to be successful. But that's like the exception, not the rule.
Yep.
And the biggest, most successful creators that I know, so much work goes on behind the scenes, like the hours in preparing scripts, in editing, and thinking
Yep.
about videos, videos that don't go live. There's so much that goes into that process, and
Yep.
I always was fortunate enough to have some successful, really successful videos, and it was never the videos that I should be successful in the sense of, like, obviously I was doing gaming. Let's say there's 1 out of 100 characters in the game, and I'm only really good at one. All of my videos that would do amazing would be all the other characters that I've never played before.
Yeah.
And the reason why it was good is because I actually sat there and I was like, oh wow, I'm actually gonna have to do some research, and then write a script and make sure that all this is correct that I'm saying.
Yep.
And it just meant that everything was really structured. Whether consciously or subconsciously, I was making sure I was getting the keywords in. It was, it's something that I'd pick up in the algorithm, and I would do loads of research into, like, Google Trends and what people were
Mm.
searching for at that moment, like when to post a video on a Tuesday or a Sunday. And that was, like, for me, writing an essay. Like, I always remember it was like being at school and writing an essay,
Yeah.
and how much, like, I hated it. So that's why for me, I'm in the seat that I am and not in
Yeah.
the creator's shoes right now. But that I think that's what people need to be prepared about, and it's like anything in life. Like, I was always very fortunate enough to be able to follow, like, my passions in whatever I've done. And that's the same advice I would give to everyone, even when it comes to content creation.
Very cool. Well, thank you so much for joining. It really has been a pleasure having this conversation.
Likewise, take care, and yeah, wish you all the best with powder.